Alan Moore never wanted and never intended for Watchmen to have a sequel. And maybe Doomsday Clock proves him right. Woof woof! Hey guys, it's me Marcus, aka the Mad Dog, and we're back with another video. Written by Geoff Johns and illustrated by Gary Frank, the first issue of Doomsday Clock was published by DC Comics in November of 2017, with the 12th and final issue being released in December of 2019. And Ozymandias is a wanted man. In the fallout of New York, he and the new Rorschach will go on the hunt for the only entity that can help them, Dr. Manhattan. But when they cross over into the DC universe and find themselves caught in the middle of escalating tensions that all revolve around the Superman theory, can these two colliding worlds exist together, or will it cause doomsday? Jumping into the art now, and Gary Frank just kills it again. He somehow manages to honour Dave Gibbons' style while still making this his own. And that's the thing that I noticed most here, and it was his ability to adapt. There were pages in here where I genuinely thought that it might have been taken straight from Watchmen, but then I'd look at it closer and I'd see all the details that he brought to it. And first things first, this is a sequel to Watchmen, and I think very much in its tone, it's still there that you can jump into this if you've only read the original story, and it's got that familiarity. It's not going to be too jarring of a change, but at the same time it still feels like a modern comic. And I'm saying that, but Watchmen still does feel like a modern comic nearly 40 years after it was first released. And as much as we might have thought that the story has to carry all that weight and all that pressure of being the Watchmen sequel, the art also has to carry that burden as well. And had it tried to go in too much of a different direction, it probably would have tonally felt like a mismatch for the Watchmen characters to be a part of this universe. And it almost might have felt like that Treehouse of Horror episode where Homer Simpson ends up in our world. However, that tone is both a blessing and a curse, because although it does match Watchmen, it does just feel a bit out of place for the DC Comics continuity. There was just something about the way that this book looked that it felt like the DC characters were more invading the Watchmen universe, which is just bizarre to me because Frank has done a lot of work for DC, but it just felt off whenever I'd see characters like Lex Luthor or Firestorm or a handful of the other characters in this. There was just something that looked like they didn't sit well in that universe. Maybe it was a stylistic choice, but for me it just felt like the wrong move. Despite that, the design of both his Batman, his Superman, and a handful of the other characters was great, and they really had that iconic look. Admittedly, it's just a shame that they weren't in this book more, but what the art does live up to is the level of detail that's in every single panel. And this somewhat justifies to me why it took over 2 years for this to get released. It just had that level of grime that I remember Watchmen for, and there was litter just everywhere, and the OCD part of my brain just really couldn't hack it. There was also this feeling that I had that Frank knew exactly how much detail was enough. So if there was a library, the shelves would be filled with books, but not to the point where there's so much detail on them that you spend longer looking at what the title of that book might be, rather than the character that's the focus of the panel. But it still felt like this was a library in a world that was lived in. And that extended into the prison scenes, and the scenes where you're on the street, or the scenes when you're on a different planet. And additionally, I just loved how that detail bled into the time periods. Because yeah, it shouldn't be spoilers that this does cross into other decades because of the fact that Dr. Manhattan's pretty much, well, everywhere. And old movies would have a logo that was reminiscent of the WB from the black and white era. The scenes from the 90s had clothes from that era, and the modern day stuff felt, well, modern. One thing that they kept for the majority of this story was a 3x3 paneling from Watchmen. The longer that the series went on, they kind of phased this out, and I do think they actually tied in quite well with the story. It was just one of those things that was really nice to see, and just an aspect to style that probably could have gone overlooked. And one thing that I couldn't get over was the nuances in his expressions. It wasn't one of those books where every character was either stoic or enraged, although there are those moments in this book, and I just really enjoy how Frank conveys character through those reactions. So yeah, when it comes to the art, there's not really a lot that I can fault. I can't even really blame people if they buy this book for the art alone. It's something I'm tempted to do with the Absolute Edition, which you can already order from the channel sponsor, Organic Price Books. They've got great packaging, fast shipping, and amazing customer services, and if you use code WOOFWOOF, you'll get $2 off your order. And if you're ordering 3 or more books and you want them to be delivered together, make sure you use code WOOFWOOF, ship it together for 5% off your entire order. Don't worry, you can just copy and paste them from the description down below, and you can use these codes as many times as you like. Jumping into the story now, and what was the point in this book? I found myself asking that question the entire way through Doomsday Clock, and I don't even ask it with any kind of negative intentions. But it does angle itself as a Watchmen sequel, so don't think that you can just jump straight into this if you haven't read Alan Moore's work. And at the same time, it wants to be its own thing that cleans up the DC continuity from the last few decades. And they are two very massive and different things to try and accomplish in just 12 issues, and he doesn't really stick the landing with either. However, before any major criticisms, I do have to respect this for trying to beat an actual continuation of Watchmen. It was set years after the fallout of New York, and it didn't just try and do some kind of wacky, here's a magic portal so that we can take these characters out of the world and and not bother with the continuity. Ozymandias had changed, a new Rorschach existed, and the political landscape had evolved. It would have been very easy to avoid thinking all of that out and just jump into it at whatever point you wanted, but because it was actually trying to be a sequel, it was interesting diving in and trying to connect the dots that they'd given me. And in those early issues, even though the pace was quite slow and deliberate, it felt like everything was building up and they were creating this tension and this sense of epic purpose. But the longer that this book went on, it felt like that slow pace was because of the fact that they hadn't really thought everything out. And then weirdly, when it finally does kick off, everything happens so quickly that you don't even really get a lot of time to process anything. And worse than that for me is that there wasn't really an engaging through line. Like in the original Watchmen, you had the mystery around the comedian's death and everything unraveled around that. And at first it looked like it was going to be centered around Ozymandias and his plan, but then that kind of fizzled out a little bit. But it was because of that lack of a through line that I often felt that this book was just kind of treading water. There is an attempt at that with the Superman theory, but it doesn't feel like it really wants to commit to it, and it kind of highlighted that maybe the Watchmen universe just wasn't really compatible with the main DC universe in the first place. On the surface, the Superman theory is interesting and it asks a question that really tied in well to DC history, so I thought this was a good move at first because it naturally implied that the DC universe could be Watchmenified with the right perspective. But the problem is that this didn't really feel like a DC universe that I was used to. I've only read a few Rebirth runs, so maybe I've missed something along the way, but to me the DC universe worships the heroes. But for the most part, it felt like it was trying to tell one story with the DC characters and a completely different one with the Watchmen ones, and they very rarely overlapped. So they just compensated for that by pretty much putting them in the same universe that the Watchmen characters were used to. However, I did really enjoy the parallels that were drawn between Dr. Manhattan and Superman, that the world was okay with him and he was the one exception, but they were angry with all the other metahumans. So I do think they managed to mould the plot in an interesting way, even if it felt like a bit of a jarring change for me in the first place. And then again, now that I'm thinking about it out loud, Gotham turns against Batman pretty much every other week, so maybe this isn't that much of a massive leap in logic. And I think it might have been a more interesting story if they had kept the DC universe the same way, instead of just trying to make it this faux Watchmen world. The fun of this event should be seeing these Watchmen characters in a different universe and just seeing a different political landscape from the one that they've got. In Doomsday Clock, they step out of their world to pretty much just go into another one that's kind of similar to it but has a few different faces. And it was pretty much just as awful as the world that they were used to. And it also just ties into one of the biggest problems that I had with Doomsday Clock. It was filled and the majority of the time was taken up with all this political commentary that felt like it didn't actually have anything to say. Like they just put it in there to tick a box because it's the Watchmen sequel, so of course you're going to do that kind of thing. But they didn't know why they were doing it or what the purpose was from the beginning. Sure, the rise of conspiracy theories and how they took precedent in the real world was fun at first, and the stuff with Black Adam and him having this kind of diplomatic immunity was cool, but I just felt like it amounted to nothing when all was said and done. Like it's saying something just because it feels like it has to and not because it wants to. But I guess to its credit, it does try its best to really connect itself to that DC continuity, so it's saying something in that regard. It is trying to have its stakes and its importance there, and maybe if it would have focused on that and, like I said earlier, set it up so it would have had a satisfying payoff, instead of just cramming all this weird pseudo-political commentary down my throat, maybe it would have been a completely different experience. Because I did like those moments where it was referencing different points throughout DC's history and even connecting it to the New 52, which despite what this book might have done, is still my jam. There was also some good moments with the butterfly effect and how changing one thing throughout the DC history could affect the entire universe. I loved Alan Scott's connection to this story, even if it was the case it felt like he kept just going over the same point again and again. And yeah, I get at first that is how Dr. Manhattan's brain works, but I also think that when Alan Moore did it, he was still saying something different if he was saying the same thing. But one plot point that really overstayed its welcome was Carver Coleman. Why was this guy in this more than Batman? I hated this storyline and it felt like it was subtext just for the sake of it. Like they knew that the pirate part existed in Watchmen, and some people, myself included, decide to skip that on every reread, and they just had to try and do their own take of it here. But it seemed to kind of miss the point completely and incorporate this into Dr. Manhattan's storyline. And not just that, he was absolutely everywhere. You had people in this old folks home watching his movies, the story of his life, flashbacks with Dr. Manhattan, news articles about him, and he just took up way too much of this book and did absolutely nothing for it. And the most disappointing thing about that is that the few scenes that we did get with Batman were really enjoyable, even if it seemed like Alfred was in this more than the Dark Knight himself. He had a few good interactions with Rorschach, and I like that he stayed Batman throughout this, because it was fun just seeing his character through the perspective of someone like Rorschach. Speaking of characters, Marionette and Mime weren't that interesting that I wanted to focus more on them than I did either the Watchmen characters or the DC ones, but unfortunately that was pretty much the case. They were introduced early on, it's telling you constantly that these are going to be important, but again, there just wasn't a satisfying payoff for me in that department. It's something that I am going to touch on a little bit in the spoiler section, but overall, when their connection to the wider plot was revealed, it just didn't really have an impact. Again, despite saying that, it's so back and forth on this review, but I did really enjoy their origin issue. It had sadness, this great emotional core, but don't get me wrong, if you were to ask me if I wanted this issue or more scenes with Dr. Manhattan or pretty much any other character, I'm gonna choose this one. Ozymandias was great in this. He was one of my favourite characters from the original Watchmen, so I'm glad that they gave him a bit of the spotlight. And admittedly, it was quite slim pickings with who they could choose. And I like that you still couldn't trust him, but there was that compulsion that people felt like they needed to work with him. It shouldn't be surprising as well that he crosses paths with Lex Luthor, and they were some of the most memorable scenes in this book. And the new Rorschach was okay. The reveal of who was under the mask was interesting, and I really liked his origin story, but the entire time it just felt like somebody who was doing a really bad job at writing Rorschach fanfiction. And I get that it's somebody who's trying to imitate the original and who is finding their face amongst this world, but they tried to incorporate this big moment where it was as if he earned that mask and he earned that title, but it still just didn't feel right to me. And I don't really know if overall it would have been better off if they decided to just not include this character. And yeah, I just wish there was more DC characters overall. We see the Green Lanterns and they're involved in quite an enjoyable fight, but they're not there for much else. Wonder Woman doesn't do a lot either, and I think considering this is the first proper time these two universes have collided, they didn't do much with that chance. And I think my main question is, why not go completely balls to the wall crazy with this? They had glimpses where they were doing that. There was a fight on a different planet that was really exciting, and the problem is this moment's never going to happen again. If this type of story does exist in the future, it's not going to be as monumental because Doomsday Clock did it before, and with that in mind, they could have just gone a lot further with it. One fun thing though is when Dr. Manhattan is looking through the history and also the future of the DC universe, and I'm really interested to see if some of the stuff that he saw in the future actually appears in the DC world, because to me Dr. Manhattan did feel quite well written in this. So all in all, I'm kind of 50-50 on this. I respected the ambition and what it attempted to do and some of the moments that it gave us as a result of that, but not so much the overall execution or the bigger plot that this book was trying to comprehend. I liked a lot of the characters, but it focused most of its attention on the wrong ones. The plot was dense but not in a satisfying way, and in all honesty I'm just not sure how memorable this will be after I'm done with this review. And who knows, because Watchmen is one of those books that every time I read it I get something new from it, so maybe Doomsday Clock's going to be the same. Maybe if I read it a year from now I'd really enjoy it because I know exactly what I'm getting into, but I think just on the surface I didn't get the book that I expected. And even with that, I can't say that I'm really disappointed with the direction that it went in. I know I'm a walking contradiction, mostly because of the fact that I am sat down right now, so I don't know if I really got my point across that well, but effectively what I'm saying is that there is some great stuff that does happen in Doomsday Clock, but unfortunately it just takes so long to happen that I didn't care by the time it started. If it had used those first 8 issues a little bit more instead of just being so slow and deliberate, then maybe I would have had a different impression of it. Because in the final third of this book it does really step it up, even if I do think that a lot of it needed a bit more setup. And I loved how it tied it in so that Superman was pretty much at the core of the DC universe, because I feel like that's something that's just so important. And I know that this is one of those books that people either rave about or they can't stand at all, and it seems like I'm taking such a middle of the road approach, but it's because when I'm looking back on it in reflection I can see that there was some great stuff that did happen in it, but a lot of stuff that I also didn't enjoy. It's not so black and white, which is why this book is a little bit difficult to review, because it seems that whenever you talk about Doomsday Clock people either want you to rip into it or unanimously praise it. And unfortunately, even though it might get me criticisms from both sides of that argument, I can't really completely agree with either. And there are a few other specific things I do want to talk about without continually just being so vague, but I guess if I wanted to get into that, it would have to be spoilers. This is your final spoiler warning, so if you don't want anything ruined, skip to the final verdict. And I didn't like how everything was wrapped up so neatly in the end. Watchmen, for as absurd as people might think that the giant squid is, at least chooses its direction and sticks to it. The horrifying realization that Ozymandias did this awful thing, but hopefully for the greater good, and the only person who'd stand against him died at the feet of the most powerful being with nobody ever knowing. It's just such a mad sequence of events that Doomsday Clock was probably never going to live up to. But it's almost like it doesn't try, and I don't think that this is going to be something that I really remember the ending of, and I think it's because of just how clean it is. Everyone is restored, the universe is restored, continuity is restored, villains meet the comeuppance, and all the heroes' names are cleared. Sure, I'm a dumb reader, so maybe I missed something, but the reason why Watchmen is so powerful is because it makes you question if this awful thing was done for the right reasons. But there's nothing like that in Doomsday Clock. I finished this book and I wasn't left with many lingering lingering questions, except for the point of why was this book made in the first place? The only aspects of the ending that I did like is how it connected to the DC multiverse, and also seeing Laurie and Daniel adopt Clark. And I also respect that Night Owl and Silk Spectre sat this one out. It just would have leaned too hard on the gimmicky side if all of them would have somehow got roped into this, and I'm just glad that those two got the normal suburban life without ever needing to come out of retirement. Unless, of course, that kid of theirs turns out to be a right dickhead, which honestly, he probably will because, you know, he's a kid. And just to go back, when I said I liked the multiverse stuff, I mean I enjoyed it in theory, because it was trying to justify all these DC reboots in quite a creative way. So I think this idea, while it's cool in principle, is one of those that causes more problems than it solves. And for me, it kind of undermined the entire DC universe that you've got so many great and powerful characters that already exist in there, but there's one that's even bigger than that just decides to not even really hang out there, but at any point he could just come back and just undo everything if he wanted to. I know that kind of goes against Dr. Manhattan's character, but who knows, 40 years from now somebody could unwrite that as well. And if I'm being honest, this is an aspect of the story that I haven't really made my mind up on, but you know, I kind of need to get this review done. The last spoiler aspect that I want to talk about, because less than 10% of people actually watch the spoiler sections, but I was disappointed with how little they did with the resurrected comedian. When he was first introduced, I had my guard up, but that's mostly because you have to protect yourself at all times, but also because I thought that this might fall into being gimmicky. Dr. Manhattan reconstructed him, sure, okay, but why not do that sooner? Why not resurrect some of the other people that have died throughout history? I brushed that off and thought it was probably something that's been explained earlier on and I just overlooked it. And I was willing to overlook it for a good story, but they just didn't do a lot with the comedian. He had a great moment with Luthor and he got a little bit of revenge on Ozymandias, but it felt like he was only really brought back into this for shock value, and then when that wore off they didn't really have a plan with him, which is quite aggravating because of the fact that they had over 2 years to figure this story out. This is my final verdict. And Watchmen is one of the most important comics that's ever existed, but Doomsday Clock is the first official attempt at a comic sequel, and it does an okay job. Do I think this is a story that needed to be told? No. Does it just feel like DC is trying to milk Watchmen's popularity? Yeah, a bit, but not in a completely distasteful way like I might have first imagined. I can't say you're missing out if you don't read this, or that it would enhance your Watchmen reading experience, but I do also think that this could have gone much worse. It does respect the characters and storyline of Moore's original work, and does an earnest job of exploring where they could go. The art respects what Dave Gibbons brought to the table while still having that Gary Frank level of detail, and at its core, it does meld together these two universes in an interesting way. I do feel that it cares more about the DC Universe continuity than it does about some of the characters that they've got there. It definitely has its many flaws, and I don't think this is a perfect sequel or anything that would make me feel like it was justified in what it was trying to do, because in the end it kind of just didn't really leave any impression on me, and I'm not sure if this is a book that I'm going to remember years from now. I'd love to be able to eat my own words, and who knows, maybe this is one of those books that gets better the more times that you read it. But on this first reading, which is what this review's based around, it just didn't do much for me, and that's for better or for worse. For something that I've seen so polarizing in the comic book community, I feel very middle of the road about this, and because of that, I'm going to give it an adequate enough score of 50%. Woof! So that's the video, hopefully you enjoyed it. Until next time, just make sure that you stay safe, and stay mad all you dogs. Woof woof! See you at the next video.